November 22, 1963. It was supposed to be a routine political visit. The sun was shining over Dallas. Crowds gathered along the streets. American flags waved in the mild Texas air. The mood was optimistic, almost celebratory. President John F. Kennedy was riding in an open-top limousine through Dealey Plaza, smiling, waving, confident. Then, in a matter of seconds, everything changed. Shots rang out. Confusion spread instantly. People screamed, some ran, others froze in disbelief. Within minutes, the most powerful man in the world was gravely wounded. At 1 p.m. at Parkland Memorial Hospital, the 35th President of the United States was pronounced dead. America did not just lose a president that day. It lost its sense of security. But what happened in those critical seconds? Was it truly the act of a lone gunman? Or is the official story only part of the truth? For more than 60 decades, questions have lingered. Documents have been sealed. Witnesses have contradicted each other. Investigations have left gaps that still trouble historians. Tonight, we revisit that day, not with sensationalism, but with careful examination. Because sometimes, history is not just about what happened, it's about what was left unanswered. And the assassination of John F. Kennedy may be the most enduring mystery in modern American history. Within hours of the assassination, authorities identified a suspect. His name was Lee Harvey Oswald, a former U.S. Marine, a defector to the Soviet Union, a man with a troubled and complicated past. According to investigators, Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, overlooking Dealey Plaza. The official conclusion would later state 1 bullet missed, 1 bullet struck President Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally. The final bullet delivered the fatal head wound. This became known as the single bullet theory. To the government, the case appeared straightforward, a lone gunman acting alone. 2 days later, while being transferred from police custody, Oswald was shot and killed by nightclub owner Jack Ruby live on national television. And just like that, the only suspect was silenced. For many Americans, that moment changed everything. If Oswald acted alone, why was he murdered before standing trial? Why did Ruby have such easy access? And why did so many early witnesses describe hearing shots from different directions? In 1964, the Warren Commission concluded that Oswald acted alone. No conspiracy, no second shooter. Case closed. But for millions of Americans, the case never truly felt closed. Because when a crime reshapes a nation, people expect clarity. Instead, they received conclusions, but not certainty. And doubt, once planted, does not fade easily. In the chaotic moments after the shots were fired, something unusual happened. Witnesses didn't agree on what they heard. Some people in Dealey Plaza immediately ran toward the Texas School Book Depository, but others ran in the opposite direction, toward a grassy area behind a wooden fence known as the Grassy Knoll. Several witnesses later testified that they heard a shot come from that direction. Some described the sound as an echo. Others were certain it was a separate gunshot. Police officers even rushed toward the grassy knoll in the immediate aftermath, briefly believing a shooter might be hiding there. Yet no gunman was officially found in that area. Over time, more than 50 witnesses would suggest the possibility of shots coming from more than one direction. Audio analysis decades later would fuel further debate, though conclusions remained contested. Were these conflicting accounts the result of panic and confusion, or did they suggest something far more complicated than the official narrative?
Human memory under trauma can be unreliable, that is well documented. But when so many people independently describe similar impressions, historians are forced to ask difficult questions. If there was only one shooter behind Kennedy, why did so many people instinctively run elsewhere? And if those witnesses were mistaken, why did some later claim their testimonies were ignored or minimized? The Warren Commission ultimately dismissed the idea of a second shooter, but skepticism had already rooted roots in the American public. Because when a tragedy unfolds in broad daylight in front of hundreds of people, the truth should feel visible. Instead, it felt fragmented. At the center of the official explanation lies one of the most debated elements of the entire case: the single bullet theory. According to the Warren Commission, one bullet, later labeled Commission Exhibit 399, struck President John F. Kennedy in the back, exited through his throat, then went on to wound Texas Governor John Connally. That same bullet was said to have entered Kennedy's upper back, exited through his throat, entered Connally's back, shattered a rib, exited his chest, shattered his wrist, and finally lodged in his thigh, all within seconds. Supporters argue the seating positions inside the limousine make this trajectory possible. Critics argued the bullet would have needed to change direction mid-air, which they claim defies physics. Even today, experts remain divided. Ballistic specialists have recreated the shot and say it is feasible. Others insist the bullet's relatively intact condition raises serious doubts. The debate is not simply about angles and wounds, it is about credibility. If the single bullet theory fails, the entire lone gunman conclusion begins to weaken. And that is why this single piece of metal became one of the most controversial artifacts in American history. Because if more than one bullet caused those wounds, then more than one shooter may have been involved, and if that were true, the implications would be enormous.
Who was Lee Harvey Oswald? The official narrative describes him as a disillusioned former Marine, politically radicalized, acting alone out of personal conviction. But his background raises complex questions. Oswald defected to the Soviet Union in 1959 at the height of the Cold War. An American ex-Marine openly moving to the USSR was not a minor event. Yet after a few years, he was allowed to return to the United States with relatively little resistance. Some have wondered, why was he permitted to come back so easily? Upon his return, Oswald displayed erratic behavior. He distributed pro-Castro pamphlets. He attempted to establish contacts with Cuban and Soviet officials in Mexico City just weeks before the assassination. To some investigators, this suggested ideological motivation. To others, it raised suspicion of intelligence connections. Was he being monitored? Was he being used? Or was he simply unstable and seeking attention? After his arrest, Oswald repeatedly denied involvement. "I'm just a patsy," he told reporters. 2 days later, before he could testify in court, he was shot and killed by Jack Ruby. And with that, the only man officially accused of assassinating President J.F. Kennedy was silenced forever. No trial, no cross-examination, no full public accounting. For many Americans, this sudden closure felt incomplete. Because when the only suspect is murdered on live television, doubt becomes inevitable. And the question remains, was Oswald truly acting alone, or was he part of a story much larger than himself? On November 24, 1963, the world watched in disbelief.
As Lee Harvey Oswald was being transferred through the basement of the Dallas police headquarters, a man stepped out of the crowd. His name was Jack Ruby. In front of cameras and live television audiences, Ruby fired a single shot into Oswald's abdomen. The accused assassin of JF Kennedy was mortally wounded. Oswald died shortly afterwards in the same hospital where Kennedy had been pronounced dead 2 days earlier. The nation was stunned. How did a nightclub owner with known connections to local figures gain access to a secure police transfer? Why was security so lax during such a critical moment? Ruby claimed he acted out of grief and anger, that he wanted to spare Jacqueline Kennedy the pain of a trial. The Warren Commission concluded that Ruby acted alone in a spontaneous emotional decision. But questions persisted. Ruby had known ties to organized crime figures in Dallas. He was familiar with police officers. He appeared unusually calm after the shooting. And perhaps most unsettling, Ruby later told reporters that the world will never know the true facts of what occurred. Was this the ramblings of a distressed man, or the suggestion of something hidden? Ruby was convicted of murder, though his conviction was later overturned. Before a new trial could begin, he died of cancer in 1967. With his death, another potential source of answers disappeared, and once again, the central figures connected to the assassination were gone before the full story could be publicly examined. Coincidence or a pattern?
To understand the atmosphere surrounding the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, we must return to the broader context of the early 1960s. The Cold War was at its peak. Just 1 year earlier, the world had stood on the brink of nuclear catastrophe during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, led by Nikita Khrushchev and Fidel Castro. President John F. Kennedy had navigated that crisis carefully, avoiding nuclear war through a tense diplomatic compromise. But behind the scenes, tensions were rising, not only with foreign adversaries, but within America's own intelligence community. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, Kennedy reportedly grew distrustful of the CIA. He publicly accepted responsibility for the failure, but privately he was said to be furious with intelligence officials who had assured him the operation would succeed. Some historians argue that Kennedy sought to reform the agency. Others believe that claim has been exaggerated. What is documented is this: Kennedy fired CIA Director Allen Dulles after the Bay of Pigs. Yet interestingly, Dulles would later serve on the Warren Commission, the very body investigating Kennedy's assassination. For critics, that detail alone raises eyebrows. Was there real hostility between Kennedy and elements of the intelligence community? Or has that narrative been amplified by decades of speculation? In the months before the assassination, Oswald had shown unusual interest in Cuba and the Soviet Union. He visited the Cuban and Soviet embassies in Mexico City. Intelligence agencies were aware of his activities. But how closely was he being monitored, and how much did the CIA truly know about him before November 22nd? These questions have fueled debate for decades. Because if intelligence agencies had prior knowledge of Oswald's behavior and failed to act, that suggests incompetence. If they had deeper involvement, the implications would be far more serious. Official investigations found no evidence that the CIA orchestrated the assassination. Yet the secrecy surrounding Cold War operations left room for suspicion. And in an era defined by covert missions and global espionage, trust was already fragile.
In the years following the assassination, the American public expected transparency. Instead, thousands of documents were classified. For decades, researchers, journalists, and historians requested access to files related to the death of John F. Kennedy. Many were denied. In 1992, Congress passed the JFK Records Act, requiring government agencies to release assassination-related documents. Yet even then, not everything was made public. Some files were withheld for reasons of national security. Others were heavily redacted. Over time, millions of pages have been released, but certain records remained sealed far longer than expected. In recent years, additional documents have gradually become public under multiple administrations. Each release generates headlines. Each batch sparks renewed debate. Supporters of the official conclusion argue that none of the newly released materials prove a conspiracy. Skeptics argue that the very act of long-term secrecy fuels suspicion. If the assassination was the work of a lone gunman, why did it require decades of classified files? Government officials maintain that some documents involve intelligence methods, foreign assets, or Cold War operations unrelated directly to the shooting itself. But for many Americans, transparency delayed feels like transparency denied. Because when trust is shaken, secrecy does not calm the public, it amplifies doubt. And the longer questions remain unanswered, the more space is created for speculation.
In the months after the assassination, most Americans accepted the conclusions of the Warren Commission. But as years passed, confidence began to erode. Poll after poll has shown a striking pattern. A majority of Americans do not believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Why? Part of the answer lies in timing. The late 1960s and 1970s were marked by revelations that shook public trust. Vietnam, Watergate, intelligence abuses. Institutions once considered unquestionable were suddenly viewed with skepticism. In that environment, the assassination of John F. Kennedy was re-examined through a different lens. New investigations, including the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s, concluded that Kennedy was probably assassinated as part of a conspiracy, though no specific group was definitively identified. That single word, probably, reignited doubt. Films, books, and documentaries further shaped public perception. Over time, the assassination became more than a historical event. It became a symbol of uncertainty. For older generations especially, Kennedy's death marked the end of an era of optimism. And when a tragedy feels like a turning point in national identity, people search for meaning beyond randomness. A lone gunman feels chaotic. A conspiracy feels intentional. Human psychology often prefers purpose over chance, even when the evidence remains incomplete. And so, 60 decades later, belief remains divided, not because of one single piece of proof, but because of accumulated questions that never fully settled. More than 60 years have passed since November 22, 1963. What do we truly know? We know that President John F. Kennedy was shot in Dealey Plaza. We know that Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested and charged. We know that Oswald was killed by Jack Ruby before he could stand trial. We know that the Warren Commission concluded Oswald acted alone. These are established historical facts. But history is not built only on facts. It is built on confidence in those facts. And that is where uncertainty remains. Unanswered questions about witness accounts, debates over ballistics, Cold War tensions and intelligence secrecy, documents withheld for decades. None of these alone prove a grand conspiracy, yet together they form a shadow that has never fully disappeared. Perhaps the enduring mystery of Kennedy's assassination tells us something deeper about America itself. A nation that believes in transparency struggles when answers feel incomplete. A democracy built on trust falters when doubt lingers. For many older Americans, Kennedy's death was not just a political event. It was a moment when innocence ended. And maybe that is why the questions persist. Because when a leader who symbolized hope is taken in broad daylight, people need clarity. Instead, they received conclusions, but not closure. And so the debate continues. Not because we lack facts, but because we continue to wrestle with what those facts mean. The assassination of John F. Kennedy remains one of the most examined events in modern history, and perhaps its greatest legacy is this: a reminder that truth, especially in moments of national trauma, is rarely simple.